It is my pleasure to introduce Heather Himmelberger, Director at the Southwest Environmental Finance Center at the University of New Mexico. Take it away, Heather.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to those who have attended Webinar 1, and welcome to all of you who are tuning in for the first time to Webinar 2. Well, what a difference a few weeks makes. When we were here a couple weeks ago, the weather was nice and sunny and warm in Albuquerque, and I think winter has finally hit Albuquerque as well as the rest of the nation. So hopefully all of you are nice and warm and inside at your computers watching the webinar. And I'd also like to just wish you all a happy Thanksgiving a couple of days early, and hope everyone has a wonderful holiday. I would also like to thank the Syracuse Environmental Finance Center for hosting today's webinar, and I want to thank Don Null for helping with the facilitation of the webinar. This webinar is part of the Environmental Finance Center Networks project that we call Smart Management for Small Water Systems. This project is funded by EPA, and it will allow us to provide managerial and financial capacity assistance to small water systems all across the country. And in this context, we're calling a small water system one that serves 10,000 people or fewer. We have provided a series of in-person workshops, and we've covered topics like asset management, rates and finance, energy efficiency, water loss, access to funding, and water system collaboration. Hopefully some of you were able to attend one of these in-person trainings that we had. And as part of this project, we're also holding webinars in most of the topic areas to accommodate anybody who either was not able to attend an in-person session or wanted to listen in on another topic other than what was offered in their state. Today's webinar is part of the Asset Management series of webinars. We are holding 5 webinars on asset management and hope that you're able to attend as many as possible. But each webinar is also a standalone webinar, so if you're not able to attend them all, that's okay too. You can just sit in on the ones that you are able to attend. So why might we want to do anything with asset management at all? Well, one reason is that management decisions around assets can be very complicated. And the types of factors that affect management are the fact that we have limited funding. And that applies both to the funding that we get from our customers as well as funding from state, federal, or other sources. We also have aging infrastructure. We put our infrastructure in a long time ago, it's getting older, and we're facing the issues around how to deal with that aging infrastructure. And then finally, we live in an era of increasing regulations. We're trying to ensure that we are as protective as public health as possible. So that means that we're going to see increasing regulations on our systems. So the big question then becomes, how do you prioritize? How do you know where and how to spend your money when you have all of these competing factors? You don't have all the money you need, you have aging infrastructure you have to address, you have regulations where that might require additional operation activities or capital investment. So how do you make those choices about where to spend your money? That's really where asset management comes in. It's really a process to help you know how and where to spend your money. It helps you improve your decision-making processes. And the formal definition that we use is maintaining a desired level of service at the lowest life cycle cost. So what we're trying to say is that we want to make sure that our assets deliver the service level that we're looking for, and we want to make sure it's at the most appropriate cost. There are 5 core components of asset management, and that's why we have a 5-part webinar series. We're structuring this such that each webinar focuses on a different core component. So the last webinar was the first component, which is the current state of the assets. In this component, we're really looking at what assets actually make up the system. And one reason we want to know this is because it's pretty hard to manage something when you don't know what you actually have. So it's really important to take an inventory, take a look at what components make up your system so that you're better able to manage them. The second component, which is the focus of today's webinar, is level of service. In this component, we're really looking at what is it we want our assets to actually achieve. What are we trying to provide with our assets? The third component, which will be next week's webinar, is criticality. And in this component, we're trying to figure out which assets are more critical to us than others, because we know that not all assets are equally important to us. It's important for us to know which of those components we really need to have treat in a different way because they're of high risk to us. The fourth component is life cycle costing. In this component, we're trying to look at how we're going to make operation and maintenance decisions regarding our assets. What are we going to do with our assets? What type of maintenance? How much maintenance? When are we going to do the maintenance? And then how are we going to handle repair, replacement, and rehabilitation decisions? When do we want to keep repairing our assets? When would we rather replace them or rehabilitate them? So that's our fourth component. And then finally, how are we going to fund the whole thing? So once we've decided what we want to do in terms of operation and maintenance, what we want to do in terms of repair and rehabilitate, we have to figure out where the funding is going to come from. So that's the last component. And we also have to figure out how to get public support to pay the rates so that we can get the revenue that we need. So just a quick review for those of you who were not with us the last webinar. We talked about core component 1, the current state of the assets. And I always like to tell people, I think this is probably the most straightforward part of asset management, the easiest to understand. That doesn't mean it's not time-consuming or doesn't take a lot of effort, but it just means it's easy to understand. It's very straightforward. What we're looking at is what assets do I own? So what are those physical things that make up the system? Where are the assets located? So we need some kind of map that shows where our assets are. We want to know what condition the assets are in. Are they good condition, bad condition, fair condition? How do they compare one to the other within our system? We want to know what the remaining useful life of our assets are. How long will each one of those assets be able to remain in service, providing the level of service that we want? And then finally, what's the replacement value of our assets? We want to know what is it going to cost us to replace those assets in the future, because that's going to help us determine how much funding we need later on and help us plan for the future when we have to do those replacement projects. So now we're going to open a poll question. This will just be for those of just kind of looking back on the last webinar. So if we could go ahead and open the poll. So this poll is looking at, after attending the last webinar, did you complete the Asset Management IQ? Did you start looking into developing an asset management team? I think we lost our poll. Can we bring our poll question back up?
Sorry, yes. Let me try and reopen it again. I'm sorry, I think I lost it. I don't think it's going to let me reopen it, Heather. I'm really sorry.
Okay. Well, we'll just move right along then. We were just going to kind of see, well, it looks like actually we had some answers. I don't know if those are real.
Only a few people voted, so that's the few people that did.
Okay, well, it's nice to see that at least a few people have already started the Asset Management IQ tool, and we're going to talk about that again at the end of the webinar. So sorry to those of you who didn't get a chance to vote, but we'll just move on. Today's webinar is going to be focused on the second core component, which is the level of service. And where I said the first component is probably the most straightforward part, the level of service is probably the one that we feel the most uncomfortable with. It's not something that we typically have done in the United States, and a lot of water and wastewater utilities feel a little bit more uncomfortable with this service level because it's sort of a new way of thinking about things. But hopefully after today, you'll have a little bit more comfort with this part of the asset management process. What I think it's important to remember is that water utilities are first and foremost customer service businesses. It's always about the customers. Traditionally, we have thought of ourselves as in the business of managing and maintaining assets. And then, oh, by the way, it provides the customer service. What we want to do is sort of flip that on its head and say what we're really in the business for is providing customer service. And, oh, by the way, we manage assets in order to do that. So what we really want to focus on first and foremost is that our job is to provide the customers the service that they need and the service that they want. And we manage assets in order to do that. In asset management terms, we're going to call this the level of service. And it's going to define the major goals of the utility. So it's going to define what level of service the utility wants to provide. There's a couple different kinds of goals you can have. You can have an external goal, which is very specifically based on what a customer would want and things that the customer would think about. Stuff like the public health protection, the health and safety of the water, the reliability of the service, customer service and how fast you respond, the pressure. There's just a few things that a customer is going to want. It's not a laundry list of 100 things that a customer is looking for. There's some very specific things that customers would be interested in. So those would be your external levels of service. You can also have internal levels of service or internal goals, and those are goals that you set for yourself within your utility. So maybe something like what the ratio of preventative maintenance versus corrective maintenance is. So if you're trying to have mostly preventative maintenance, you might set a goal that you want to have 75% preventative maintenance and 25% corrective maintenance, so that you're trying to switch your operation to be more proactive and less reactive. That's not something that a customer will be so much interested in. It's more for your internal staff and your internal operations. So you can set goals, major goals, that focus on externally what the customers want and then internally what you want to do as an organization. The level of service that you set then, the goals that you set, will help you determine what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, when you do it, and how you spend your money to meet the needs of your customers. So as an example, if you set the goal that the customers want you to remove iron from the water. Iron is actually a secondary contaminant. It's an aesthetic concern rather than a public health concern. Perhaps you're not removing iron now, but your customers really want you to do that. Well, the fact that you will set that level of service goal that you're going to remove iron from the water will change the way you're spending your money. You're going to have to spend some money maybe to install some treatment facilities. You might have to change your operations. Maybe your operator needs a different level of certification. So when you set those different service levels, it will start telling you where you need to invest your money within your utility to meet those level of service goals. The level of service process is also a chance to have a conversation with your customers. It gives you a chance to find out what's really important to them. It also is a chance to get them to support the utility, so that instead of being an adversarial relationship between the utility and the customers, it can be a very collaborative relationship. If they understand what you're trying to do is meet their needs and their goals, they're much more supportive of your utility overall. As an example, there was a utility that I talked to once who had a level of service goal that they were going to repair and return to service all pipe breaks within 4 hours. So they set about trying to have that kind of level of service, that when a pipe was broken and reported to them, they would go out, fix the break, and return that pipe back to service within 4 hours. Well, as their number of breaks increased, it became increasingly difficult to meet that level of service, and it was starting to get very expensive, because you can imagine if you're going to do something that fast, you have to have a lot of equipment, trucks, personnel, so it can be quite expensive to try to keep up that level of service. So they had a couple of choices. They could ask for further investment from their customers to continue the level of service they had, or they could try to change the level of service to something else. They decided it was important to ask their customers what they wanted to do, so they held some focus groups and asked their customers how important it was to them to maintain that 4 hours of returning the pipe to service. And what they found out was that it really wasn't all that important to their customers that they maintain the 4 hours. The customers really wanted to be notified 15 minutes before the water got shut off, whenever possible, so they would be able to prepare for it. So they could put water in their bathtub, and if they needed it, they could put water in their refrigerator for later. They could fill their sinks. They could finish whatever they were doing before the water got shut off. And they said, as long as you let us know 15 minutes in advance, we would actually be willing to accept a longer time before you return the pipe to service. You could have it out longer. So that was a case where having that conversation with the customers allowed the utility to find out what was really important and save them money, because they changed their level of service to better fit what the customers wanted, and they were then everybody kind of won because the customers got what they wanted and the utility saved some money and operated in a different fashion. It's also a chance to explain to your customers the relationship between service and cost, because service and cost is related. The higher level of service, the higher the cost. The lower level of service, the lower the cost. Now we have to remember, however, there is a minimum level of service that we must provide our customers. We can't go below our state and federal regulations. So when we're talking about lower level of service, we're not talking about going that low. So our bare minimum level is going to be meeting all the state and federal requirements that we have to meet, and some of those requirements relate to water quality, some of them relate to pressures, and various things. So we won't go below that, but we can go above it, and we can actually go substantially above it or a little bit above it. And that's where we get into the higher levels of service and higher costs. So if you want to remove a lot of aesthetics from the water, things like iron, manganese, materials like that, you can do that, except it's going to cost you more money. You would still be meeting the federal and state requirements if you had secondary contaminants in the water. If you leave them in the water, that's a slightly lower level of service. That would mean a lower cost. If you take them out, that would be a higher level of service and a higher cost. Pressure is similar. Maybe you have to, if your customers want a pressure of, say, 60 psi throughout the system, that may require you to have booster pumps or storage tanks and things like that. Whereas maybe if they're willing to accept, say, 40 psi, the cost may be lower. So it's very important for your customers to understand that relationship between a higher level of service and a higher cost, or lower level of service, lower cost, so that they can support the operation that you want to have, and they can understand that they need to pay for it. If they want a higher level of service, they have to pay for that. We're going to show, or we're going to play the audio from a video. Last webinar we found out that it was a little bit difficult to stream video over the webinar. So rather than streaming the video, we're just going to leave a still picture up, and then we'll just play the audio so that it won't be a problem with the quality of the video. So Dawn, if you wouldn't mind starting the video. This is a video from Kevin Campanella from the city of Columbus, Ohio, talking about level of service.
As municipalities, we tend to be internally focused because we're monopolies. We have no competition. If the complaints aren't rolling in day after day, then we tend to focus on what will make our jobs easier. How can we continue to do the same things we've been doing over and over again, and yet maybe do it in a little bit easier way? We should really be worried about what the customer would think. That's what our thought process should be every day. Everything that we do, whether it's long-range planning down to day-to-day activity, we should always ask the question, what would the customer think? It puts you in a place where you're accountable. There are no surprises to customers. There really should never be a situation where you would have a ratepayer revolt because you have to raise rates in order to provide service. The decision is ultimately in the customer's hands at that point.
Okay, so level of service is all about setting those goals for your utility. What is it you want your utility to do? And we talked about you can set external goals, which are those factors that would be important to your customers, and you can set internal goals that are more the factors that are important to your utility. One of the things that we have stolen from other venues is the SMART acronym. It really works well with goal setting because it helps you determine what kind of goals you ought to be setting. So we're talking about being specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, or I also use the word realistic, and then time-bound. So we'll go through what each of these elements mean in your process of goal setting. So let's look at the goal set, the S part, specific. If you set a goal that said we're going to provide good water or we're going to have good pressure, what would that mean? The problem with a goal like that is we don't know what it means. If you ask several people what good water is, they would define it differently. One person may be related to regulations, another person may be taste and odor, another person maybe what the water looks like. So we're not really clear what that goal actually means. Or if we say something like have good pressure, I might think good pressure is 50 psi, and somebody else might think it's 40, or somebody else might think it's 70. We really don't know what those goals mean. So those don't work very well. So instead, it would be much better for us to have something like meet the Safe Drinking Water Act, primary drinking water standards 100% of the time. Now, instead of saying provide good water, we know exactly what good water means. We're saying that it means meeting the primary drinking water standards all of the time. And you can actually have several goals that relate to good water. You could have 2 or 3 others that maybe address aesthetic concerns or address other aspects of what it means to be good water. But the point is you want to be very specific. Now, with this other goal, I know exactly everybody who reads the goal, meets Safe Drinking Water Act all the time, knows exactly what I'm talking about. Everybody can relate to that goal. And related to the pressure, we have provide minimum water pressure of 50 psi throughout the system 95% of the time. Now we can be very clear what have good pressure means to us. We're saying that it means 50 psi as a minimum throughout the system, and we're going to do that 95% of the time. We'll talk a little bit later about why you want to have those caveats of 95% of the time in the last element of Timebound. The next thing is we really want our goals to be measurable. It's very, very important that if we set a goal, we can measure whether we achieved it. If we don't have the ability to measure a goal, it doesn't really help us much because we don't know if we actually accomplished what we set out to. So as a couple examples here, we could say something like have exceptional customer service or provide reliable water service. But if we did that, again, we won't be able to measure these goals because we don't know what it is we're trying to achieve. So what does exceptional customer service mean? How would I measure that? So instead, we want something like respond to water quality complaints by the next business day 95% of the time. Now this goal we can actually measure. We could say, okay, when we can check when the water quality complaints come in, we can log that in, and then we can check when we actually address them. We can see if that's the next business day. And then if we waited over time, say, each month or every 3 months or 6 months, we could check to see if we were doing that 95% of the time. The next one, for reliable water service, we could say provide water continuously to all customers 95% of the time. Now we know exactly what that goal means. And again, we could measure this goal. We could check which customers get shut off whenever we do repairs or maintenance activities. We could track how long they were shut off. And then again, over time, we could see if the customers received water 95% of the time, like during the month or during the year. Now, the one thing that you would have to look at as you're setting your goals is, do you have the data to actually measure either of these goals? So if you set these as your goals, the next question you would ask is, do I keep track of water quality complaints? And do I keep track of when I address those complaints? If you do not do that now, you either have to start doing it so that you can measure the goal, or you can't have this as your goal because you won't be able to measure it because you don't have the data. So you have to take one of those 2 paths. You could start collecting the data. You could have your personnel log in when they receive complaints and then log when they got addressed. The other one, providing water continuously to all the customers, you would have to track which customers were shut off during each repair or maintenance activity, and you would have to log that somewhere. So again, you have to ask yourself, do you have that kind of data, or will you be able to get that kind of data once you set the goal? Because it's very important that you are able to measure them and you have the data in which to measure it. So attainable. We do not want to set goals that we can't attain. This is not about trying to set the most outrageous goal and then see if there's any way we can meet it. It's really about setting goals that fit your operation, fit what your customers want. We really do want you to be able to meet the goals. So something like provide response to all customer complaints within 15 minutes at all times. That's really not an achievable goal. I don't think you could ever have enough staff, unless you maybe only get 1 or 2 complaints a year, to have this kind of operation. And especially if you don't have very many staff at all, you're not going to be able to respond to every complaint that came in within 15 minutes. This would be a very expensive way to operate. It would be very difficult. So it's probably not attainable for most utilities to have this kind of response. So instead, we might have a goal that says, will provide customer service response within 8 hours during normal business operation. This may be a more doable goal, and then we've defined that normal business is Monday to Friday, 8 to 5. So in this case, we could actually have a goal that we were able to meet, and it was attainable for us, rather than having a goal that there's no way we can ever meet. So then as we monitor that goal, we find out that month after month we haven't met it. So it's really important to make sure that our goals are something that we can actually achieve. And then we want the goal to be realistic. This is somewhat related to attainable. However, sometimes goals are attainable, but it's not really realistic to do so. So, for example, reduce overall water use by 20% within 6 months through a water conservation program. Well, we may be able to achieve a 20% reduction in water usage, but probably not through a 6-month period. We probably need a longer process. So it may be more realistic to say something like reduce per capita water use by 20% within 3 years through a water conservation program. So now we're trying to say, okay, we can get to the 20% reduction, but we can't do it within 6 months. We need to have a little bit longer time frame, and we want to be realistic about what it's going to take to actually achieve that goal. And then lastly, we want to have goals that are time-bound when necessary. And there's a couple different elements there. So a goal like this, brakes will be fixed when discovered, doesn't really have any time-bound elements. What we want to do is something like brakes will be fixed within 8 hours of discovery 90% of the time. So there's actually 2 different time-bound elements in there. One is how soon are we going to fix them, and we said within 8 hours of discovery. So that's one element of it that we're trying to achieve a time frame for when we'll do the repair. And the second time element is the 90% of the time. And I referred to this at the very beginning that we had a couple of these goals. It said something like 95% of the time or 90% of the time. The reason we put that in there is we don't want to have our customers thinking that our operation is going to be 100% of the time we can deliver water and nothing will ever go wrong. It's important for our customers to understand that there are going to be situations in which they'll be without water, or we can't repair a break within 8 hours because some unusual situation has occurred. So, for example, if we're saying we're going to provide water service, uninterrupted water service, 24/7, 365, that's really not realistic. We know that water pipes will break from age, from environmental conditions, maybe it gets too cold, or there's a surge, or maybe even a construction contractor hits one. So there will be times when customers are without water, and it's important for them to understand that. For even a well-run utility, it is not possible to do things 100% of the time. So it's important to put a little caveat on some of these things that kind of fit what you're trying to achieve most of the time, but you have to recognize that there may be emergency situations, like for example, maybe you have operators that are out sick, and several of them are off duty, and you have very cold weather and lots of breaks, and you can't possibly get to them all, within 8 hours. It's important for your customers to understand that sometimes that's okay, but we want to not make that the norm, but rather the exception. So we put the 90% of the time saying this is our normal routine operation, but there will be emergencies or other situations that may prevent us from doing that. So if you select goals that fit all of the SMART criteria, you will have goals that are very specific. Your customers will clearly understand what they are, or your utility personnel will understand. So for example, if your utility personnel sees brakes will be fixed within 8 hours, they know exactly what the expectations of the utility are for their work efforts. So we have goals that are specific, they're measurable, we can meet them, and we've put these caveats so that we know exactly how often and how long we have to do them. Now we're going to show a little video from Stacy, formerly with Johnson County Wastewater, talking about how they measured their goals. And in this case, they actually have a one-page sheet that they use as a way to collect the information about the goals and how well they've met them. So I will show just some still pictures as the video is playing, as the audio is playing, so you can see a little bit about what's on their one-page sheet for the goals. So Dawn, if you would go ahead with the audio.
We do monitor those. We send out monthly reports and quarterly manager reports to the county manager's office. so that they can see how we're doing in those particular areas. It's broken into treatment and collections, and so we have plant violations. We also include how much flow was treated and how many violations we had for the month. The side are the categories we're reporting on, and then on the right side are our level of service goals, so what we're targeting. So the top has some basic information about how much flow was treated and total number of violations for the month of May. And then we report by each plant. This month we had no plant violations, so we were 100% compliant, where our target is for 5 or fewer for the year. We had no wet weather issues for this month. If I scroll down, we've got the solid disposal. We're 100% compliant there, which is what our goal is also. And then we're targeting to do 40% or more biosolids that our land applied. And for May, we made 46%. And we have odor complaints. We only had 1 for the month. We've had 2 for the year. And that's the basic report, monthly report that comes out of operations and maintenance. We have this and some other information that's compiled for quarterly management reports. But as far as asset management related, this is where most of it comes from.
Okay, so you can see from what she was talking about that they actually have their goals set out and then what the level that they're trying to achieve is. So it's a nice, simple one-page sheet that collects all of the goals for their utility, which brings us to our next acronym, which we've also stolen from other places, the KISS acronym. And in our case, we use it as keep it simple and sustainable. We don't want to go crazy with trying to set, hundreds of service levels and getting very crazy with what kind of goals we're trying to meet. We want to keep it very simple. We want to keep it something that we can do over time. So we want to have goals that are very important to us, goals that we can measure, and goals that we can track, and keep it something that we can sustain over the long term. So Don, if you would play the audio for this video.
I think it's really important that when you establish your service levels that you want to track, that you're not tracking 100 service levels, that you're not tracking service levels on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis, because that becomes overwhelming for staff. They may be unwilling to do it. It may not be worth the value that you're going to get out of the service levels. So it can be done on a month-to-month basis. There may be some measures that are quarterly or maybe annually. But we track just using simple Excel spreadsheets at this point. I know there are a lot of different software packages out there that are available to track service level measures and then all the key performance indicators throughout your organization that go into meeting those service levels. And it can become overwhelming, but it really doesn't need to be that way. We just use spreadsheets, and we have different managers throughout the organization report those numbers, and we just compile them into spreadsheets. And we create graphics. We show performance over time, and we just have our targets shown on those graphics. And what's really important is that you have the conversations about why you met or didn't meet your targets. Those are the conversations that help you understand your business and help you make adjustments to your organization. If you are overperforming or underperforming, you may be spending too much or too little in a certain area. And that's the ultimate goal of setting those performance levels, is to make sure that you, again, have that right balance between providing the services your customers want and you're spending the appropriate amount of money on doing it.
Okay, so I'd like you to think about now how setting goals can change your operation and management, how you think about your utility, how that changes when you set goals, because it really does change when you start to set a goal and you know that that's what your purpose is, that's what you're trying to do. It changes things. So think about your response for the two different sides of this. What if you meet the goals and what if you don't meet the goals? So think about, suppose you have a goal that you're going to provide water at a pressure of 50 PSI throughout the system 95% of the time and you don't meet that goal. What does that mean for your operations? How would you respond to that? Does that mean that you need extra facilities, you need booster pumps, or you need storage tanks? Is there a certain part of the system that's having trouble? Do you have settings that are incorrect on your pressure reducing valves? What is actually happening? It would give you a chance to sort of investigate your system and think about, why are we not meeting that goal? And what do we need to do to respond to it? And if that goal is really important to your customers, and it turns out that it is not possible to meet it from just changing operations, that you actually need to invest in some assets, that's something you can go forward with to your governing bodies, the people who make decisions about rates and investments, and say, look, we just can't meet this goal without an investment in additional infrastructure or additional training or something, whatever it is, because we can't meet this goal. Or you're not meeting this goal because you haven't prioritized it. Is it the fact that you could have met the goal, but maybe you didn't meet it just because it wasn't a priority within operations? So that could change how you deal with your operators and what they prioritize during their day. Think of the flip side. Well, what if you met all your goals? What does that mean with your relationship for your customers? Can you use that as a means to try to get customer support going forward, when you want rate increases and you want customers to invest in the utility and be supportive of you? Is the goal, the fact that you've met the goals, the things that they wanted, something that you can use to help garner that public support for your utility? And just think about how just having a goal would change your focus on what you're doing and why you're doing it. So even if you don't have a lot of goals, just even having some goals can really change how you think about your utility and how you act in the operations and management of your utility. Something to remember is that goals are not set in stone. Goals can be changed over time. So if you think that you don't have the right goals or you haven't set the right levels, you can always change them. You can also add or remove goals. Maybe the situation has changed. Your customers now want something that they didn't want before. Or you want to add an internal goal that you didn't have before. Or maybe you want to remove a goal because it just didn't make sense, or it's something that you can't do anymore, or you don't have the funding to keep it up. So you can always add or remove goals, and you can always adjust goals over time. So maybe you pick one service level that you try to meet, and then it turns out that that really is not possible, or it really seems like you would have to invest a lot of money to reach that level, and maybe you could reach another level that would be just as good to your customers without an investment. So as an example, we can go back to the pressure idea. What if you had set out the goal as 50 PSI, and you find out that you cannot meet it, but you could meet 45 PSI. The question would be, is it really worth the investment of money to try to meet the 50 PSI, or would your customers be equally as satisfied if you switched the level to 45 PSI? And you could do either of those things. If your customers really want it to be 50 PSI, if that's what's necessary to serve them, you could make the investments and you could keep it at 50, or you could say, we can adjust it down to 45. Our customers are okay with that. We can operate at that level and save the investments and not have to put in additional facilities. So again, keep that in mind, that goals are changeable, can be added, removed, and adjusted as you need to. So now we have a poll question on level of service goals at your utility. Lisa, if we could open the poll. So the poll says, at my facility, either we don't have any goals right now, we have thought about setting goals, but we haven't done it yet. We have set goals, but we don't measure whether we meet them, or we have set goals and we measure whether we meet them. So where do you stand right now at your facility in terms of goal setting? So take a moment and just click on the one that best describes your facility and how it's going. Okay, so we have 41% of the folks that currently have not set goals. 24 have thought about it but haven't done it yet. We have 12% that have set goals but don't measure, and 24 that have goals and are measuring. So we have about 36% of the folks that have goals. And that's probably fairly typical when I'm out and about meeting with water utilities for all different reasons. I know that quite a few have not yet taken the step of setting goals. And hopefully after today, you'll see a little bit more about why you might want to take that step and go forward with setting goals. All right, if we can go back to the presentation. All right, so now we're come to the part of the webinar where we talk about what you can do at your own facilities based on what you've heard today. And I have a couple of slides that are based on things that we talked about last time as well. And these are some general things that you can do. And for those people who were not here the last time, one of the things that you can do at your facility is really look around you and see what other people might be able to help you implement asset management. Who at your facility is somebody that you could work with to help you do the various components of asset management? So developing a team. And your team can be smaller or larger depending on your utility and how many people you have. If you're a very small utility, the team could end up being very, very small, maybe 1 or 2 people. If you have more people in your utility, more customers, you would want to have a bigger team. You would want to have people from whoever's doing your finances, whoever runs your management operations. You want to bring together a team of people that have various perspectives. And the wider the perspectives you have, the better off you're going to be. The second one we talked about last time was completing the interactive asset management IQ tool. We have that on our website. You can go online. I know based on a couple of responses on our first poll that a few people have done so. What this does is establish your baseline of where you are in asset management practice right now. And it's a really good first step to do. It tells you kind of where your strengths and weaknesses are. It kind of gives you that baseline that you can measure your progress against as you move forward with asset management activities. So if you haven't done the Asset Management IQ, I recommend that you look to doing that. Then I'm going to say that my suggestion is develop at least 2 goals for your facility. If you don't currently have any goals, think about developing at least 2 goals for your facility. They can be internal or external, whichever you would like. And at this point, if you don't involve your customers too much, that's okay. It's just to get you started in the whole goal setting process of, what do you want your utility to provide? Think about, think about yourself as a customer of your water utility. What would be important to you? And that can be a starting place, even just asking your employees, what matters to them as water customers, and try to develop a couple of goals that would meet their needs as water customers, just to get you started on how this process works. And as I said before, you can always add to those goals. So if you start a couple of them, see what that's like, try it out, and then you can add goals later as you go until you have the number of goals that you think you need for your facility. After you set the 2 goals, check and see if your goals are SMART. Remembering what SMART is: specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. So make sure your goals meet that criteria. And really the 2 most important ones are that they're specific and measurable. You want to make sure that anybody could read your goal and understand what it's all about, and anybody who read your goal would have the same ideas about what it meant, and you want to be sure that you can measure it. If you need to, you can revise your goal until it does meet those SMART criteria. Then think about what data would you need to measure those 2 goals that you set. So if I set a goal on customer service, I'm going to need some customer service data. If I set a goal on pressure, I'm going to need some pressure data. If I set a goal based on meeting the standards of the Drinking Water Act, I'm going to have some data from my laboratory. So whatever you need to measure that goal, start thinking about it. And if you don't have it, start collecting that data. So if it's data that you need but don't have, put in place whatever processes you would need in order to get that data. So our final poll question of today's webinar is going to be, which step do you think you would implement first after hearing about core component 2, the level of service? So if we could, let's start our poll. Okay, so your choices here are develop an asset management team, complete the interactive asset management IQ, develop at least 2 goals, check to see if the goals are SMART, and collect data to measure the goals. So where do you think you might start in your process? You know, based on what you've heard today, what kinds of activities would you do at your facility? Okay, so it looks like our poll shows that we'll have about a quarter of us will develop an asset management team. About 40% will complete the interactive asset management IQ. 27% develop some goals, and then 5% for each of the other 2. So I think, you know, I strongly encourage you to take the asset management IQ, develop your team, and start thinking about the goals that you would set for your utility, and just try a couple of them out. Even if you don't take them very far, even if they're just something that you keep internal to yourself at the beginning till you get your feet wet doing this, just try it out, because it will change how you start thinking about your utility. And although it doesn't seem like it, it does have a different mindset when you start doing goals and checking whether you met them or not. So I do strongly encourage you to at least take the plunge and try a couple of goals. We've come to the end of this portion of the webinar before we get to the Q&A, and now would be a good time to send those questions in if you have them that we can answer. We do want to thank EPA for providing the funding for this project. We very much appreciate the opportunity to work on this project and get around the country and work with small water systems. And then we have our contact information. I just want to remind you that you're welcome to contact either myself or Don Null at the email addresses that are provided there. You can also find contact information on the efcnetwork.org website. So please feel free to go there. That's where we will post the webinar today. You'll have a link there, and also the slides will be posted there as well. We did receive questions from our first webinar, and we're going to combine the questions from the first 3 webinars and send those out because our 3rd webinar is actually already next week. So we will go ahead and collect all the questions and comments that we received from all 3 webinars and send you the responses to those as one set of comments. And finally, the last thing I'll add is that we will also be sending you a link for an evaluation, and that will be another opportunity to ask questions or provide comments on the webinar. So with that, we've come to the end of our formal presentation, and I will ask Dawn if we've received any questions that we need to answer.
We had a question about the Asset Management Webinar 1 and if that would be available. And right now we do have the presentation online, but that presentation was not recorded, so the recording is not available, but the PDF of the presentation is available.
We're also thinking that because we did have a lot of requests for the recording of the webinar, we're either going to rebroadcast that one again and then record it, or we'll just make a recording of it and putting it up. So at a later date, we will make that available to everybody.
And we have a question. It says, many small systems find it challenging to meet the minimum, for example, the regulatory requirements. Any suggested goals for these systems?
I think what's good for a smaller system that's really trying to focus on meeting the regulatory goals is to break it up into smaller pieces. So sometimes just meeting, if we say we're going to meet the state and federal regulations, that's pretty broad, overarching. There's a lot of different pieces of meeting the regulations. For example, we have monitoring, reporting concerns. We have the actual water quality levels. There's the CCRs. You know, there's all these different components that go into meeting compliance. We also have various rules. So what you might want to do if you're a smaller system is break it up into smaller bite-sized chunks as a goal. Maybe your goal is just to meet, to be able to provide the CCR by July 1st every year. You know, if that's been a hard goal, you know, hard thing for you to do, you might put that in as a goal just so that you know you're trying to achieve that. You might have, like each rule, I will try to comply with total coliform rule, you know, 100% of the time. Or I will try to meet my monitoring and reporting requirements under the total coliform rule 100% of the time. So you can kind of break it down into some smaller chunks where it doesn't look so overwhelming. And then that way you can kind of see, well, what part of the regulatory process is the most difficult for me? Is it the actual reporting part? We do have systems that have that as their biggest concern. For example, there's a system that I've talked to who has concerns about the ability to pay the laboratory fees. And because they don't pay the laboratory fees, they don't get the monitoring reporting. So then they get a monitoring reporting violation every month. So this particular system has a problem where the upper management will not release the funds to be able to pay the lab fees. If they had set a goal that said we will meet all the requirements, or we will meet the monitoring reporting requirements, and then they're able to show the customers they don't meet them, that can add some pressure to the governing body to say, look, it is really important to our customers that we meet the monitoring reporting. You need to spend the money that it takes to pay the lab fees so we can meet those requirements. So I think my biggest advice would be maybe breaking it down into some smaller goals that are very specific about regulatory compliance to kind of help you, you know, guide you through that process.
Another question, how would you differentiate to the ratepayers the value of higher service versus lower service?
I think what you do there is you try to be very specific about, you know, suppose the customers are clamoring for something, an area that doesn't have fire flow, wants fire flow, for example. And they say, we would really like to have a level of service goal that you will provide fire flow to our community. That could be a very expensive undertaking because you have to maybe change the size of the pipe, add hydrants, you might have to add a water tank, maybe increase the size of a water tank, something like that. So if you were very specific and said, look, we can do this, this level of service goal will cost every customer, you know, $10 a month extra on their water bill, you can make the connection very clear. You can use goals that are maybe not quite that dramatic where you're saying, okay, well, we're going to have a customer service response within 8 hours. Well, that means we have to hire an extra staff person in order to meet that. Well, that's going to be, I don't know, maybe $1 a month per customer to have that. So you can say, okay, well, if we want to meet the customer service goal, it will cost you $1 a month extra. You can go the opposite direction and say, well, we're currently removing iron from the water. That's costing every customer, you know, $3 per month for us to run our iron removal facility. If you guys decide you no longer want us to remove iron from the water, we could reduce $3 from your bill. However, you're going to put up with, you know, all the issues related to having iron in the water. And usually with water systems, it's kind of an all or none. It's not like half the community in general can have water with no iron and half does. So everybody kind of has to agree to the same level of service, and they have to be sort of told, this is what it would cost me if we're going to have this level of service, this is what it is. If we're going to have that level of service, that's what it is. So you're trying very specifically what that level of service is to what the cost a customer is going to pay.
Okay, another question, do you have suggestions on ways to secure commitments and support from upper management?
That's a tough one. But there's two different kinds of upper management. There's sort of the internal manager type people, and then there's sort of the governing body type people. And that's a tough one because it's always hard to get them to agree to commit the money to what you want to do. But my best advice, I guess, is to say that you want to make it as difficult as possible for them to not see things the way that you do. Like if you know that there's a risky situation and you know you need to meet a level of service and you know that you're going to be required to have certain amount of money to prevent a problem, you need to be very clear and very factual with what you provide to the upper management so that they know they're taking on a considerable risk if they don't want to provide the funding. I mean, it's very important for them to know what you're trying to do, you know, what the data is that shows why you want to do something, you know, very, very factual information, you know, I think is very important. And the other part is to try to get buy-in from them for, you know, something even like goal setting. I think if you talk to your upper management, explain what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it, so that ultimately, if you go down this path, you will have the most efficient operation you can have. That's typically a goal anybody can relate to. So whether you're a governing body or upper management, if you say where we're headed is the most efficient operation, that doesn't mean the absolute cheapest operation, doesn't mean we're driving the race to zero. We're trying to have the most efficient operation so that we can give our customers what they want at a reasonable price, and then I think you're more likely to get the buy-in from the upper management. But that is a difficult step, and it will take some time and effort to accomplish. So thank you, everyone, for sticking in there with us and listening to today's webinar. We very much appreciate your time, and again, I hope everyone has a happy Thanksgiving and a wonderful holiday. I hope everybody stays safe and in their travels and has a wonderful day with their families.
Thank you, Heather. Take care, everyone.
Goodbye.